Arup acknowledges the traditional owners across all lands, waters, and skies the firm may reach. We acknowledge their wisdom, resilience, and rich cultural heritage. We pay our respects to the elders past and present, and to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. We recognise the ongoing journey of healing and reconciliation, and Arup commits to walking alongside First Nations peoples to acknowledge their teachings and foster a future of unity and respect. Welcome to Arup's podcast, Sustainable Forces, a podcast about people joining forces to help solve some of the most complex sustainable development challenges. I'm your host, Dr. Michelle Dickinson, and today we are talking about the Pacific Islands, an island region of the Pacific Ocean made up of 14 independent countries. These island nations are known for their rich culture and resilience, having thrived for over 3,000 years in some of the world's most isolated environments. Despite contributing just 0.03% of global carbon emissions, they are considered to be one of the world's most at-risk regions to climate change. Situated on the front line of the climate crisis, they are also at the forefront of climate solutions. Now, I've spent a lot of time in this region, and from my perspective, they really are pioneering the climate adaptation strategies that many countries will need in the future. The Cook Islands is a great example of this, leading the way when it comes to adapting to climate change. With a population of almost 15,000 people spread over 15 small atolls, communities and government are responding and partnering to fight in the face of rising seas and extreme weather. To understand more about how the Cook Islands is tackling some big challenges, I spoke to Matt Blacker, National Programme Manager, Climate and Ocean Services at the Office of the Prime Minister, Cook Islands Government, and Karen Barnes, Arup's resilience and risk expert. Together, we explored how far the Cook Islands has come over the last 10 years to prepare for climate events. We also talked about the web of partnerships that make climate adaptation possible and the complexities within island cultures and the importance of context. I hope you enjoy the insights from this conversation with Matt and Karen as much as I did. Hi, Matt. Welcome to the podcast, and thank you for joining us from the Cook Islands today. Now, we have lots of listeners from around the globe who might not know where the Cook Islands are, so can you tell us a little bit about where you are and what your role is there?
Good morning, Michelle. Yeah, so the Cook Islands is it's a big ocean state. It's got a lot of ocean, about 2 million square kilometres of ocean, in fact. But it sits between French Polynesia to our east and Samoa to our west. And probably the easiest way to think of it, most people know where Hawaii is, and out in the middle of the Pacific on the north side of the equator. Cook Islands is like mirroring that to the south. So where I am in Rarotonga right now is exactly the same distance as what Hawaii is from the equator, but to the south. So in the central South Pacific Ocean. My role here is that I'm a project manager for a large climate and ocean science program around the space of early warning systems and climate science, that kind of area.
Amazing. And Karen, welcome. And you're in San Francisco. Can you tell us a little bit about your role at Arup and also how you started working with Matt?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me on the podcast, Michelle. I work in Arup's risk and resilience practice, based out of the San Francisco office. In my role, I work with clients to help them understand the potential impacts of natural hazards, so things like floods, cyclones, and wildfires, and how they may impact the built environment, so their people, their operations, their buildings, and things like that. I also work with them to identify solutions to help them adapt. What can they do to reduce their risk and increase their resilience in the face of a changing climate? And so I work with clients across the gamut. So clients like Matt in government, often in collaboration with multilateral development banks like the Asian Development Bank. We work with transportation agencies, private sector, Fortune 500 companies, as well as nonprofits and foundations. And so working with clients across these different sectors really allows us to see the problem from many different perspectives and to understand, how challenges and priorities may differ. So in terms of how I started working with Matt, we're currently working on a climate resilience study in the Cook Islands. So really focused on the Rarotonga International Airport and port.
Amazing. And look, we talk a lot about resilience on this podcast, but resilience is going to mean something different for different communities and have a different definition. And in the Pacific Islands, for example, we know that the Pacific Islands have shown incredible strength for over 3,000 years and have thrived in some of the most remote places on Earth. But also today, they're some of the most climate exposed regions. And so I think they're leading the way in some of the climate solutions that the rest of the world can actually follow. So, Matt, you are on the ground out there in Rarotonga. You've got first-hand experience. Can you help us to understand how the Cook Islands is pioneering some of these ways to adapt and respond to climate change?
Yeah, okay. It's a really good question. And look, I agree with the idea. Resilience means something different to different communities. And some of our islands are very exposed to different sorts of climate risks, climate hazards. For us, I think one good example, I guess, that we could have a little bit of a look at, and that I've been working on in particular, is about our risk knowledge, or just knowledge to make good decisions around climate risk and climate exposure. If I think back maybe 10 years ago, we had almost no good information on which to make informed decisions, quantitative information, yeah? So we had no mapping of our islands. We knew that our islands were exposed to climate risks, things like tropical cyclones, coastal inundation, and have been, for since their existence, really. But we had no good information to base good decisions on, and so we knew that we needed to move forward and adapt to climate change, but didn't have that foundation. And so when I fast forward to sort of where we are now, in the last few years, we've really pushed forward with changing that and turning that around. We've collected LiDAR elevation mapping, for example, of all of our islands now. We can tell you exactly how high every house is on every island across 2 million square kilometres of ocean. We're using that mapping of all of our islands to build early warning systems, best practice forecasting systems. And so sort of leading that way on going from having very limited information to now having almost an overwhelming amount of information to be able to provide that early warning to our communities when there might be some sort of climate risk coming up. It could be a drought, it could be a cyclone, it could be a flood of some sort. But we're also in a position now to have informed adaptation to climate change. We know what needs to happen, where it needs to happen, and when. So really, I think that's one way that the region is starting to lead, I think, is on having that detail. And we can do it because our islands are relatively small. That scale is smaller compared to, say, a whole country like maybe Australia or America, where the land, the exposure, it's all very diverse. We've got a constrained area. So I think that's one area where we're leading, yeah.
And carries on with a theme throughout this podcast, which is great data, and being able to measure stuff allows us to make great decisions. So, Karen, you've been working with Matt and some of the other island nations and organizations for some time now. So you might have a different perspective on resilience to climate change. Can you share that with us?
Yeah, absolutely. Just to build on what Matt was saying, and I think that it is really important to have, the scientific and engineering basis that sits behind the climate solutions that are being developed. And so, yeah, maybe just to share a little bit more about the work that I am doing with Matt. So we're doing a two-phase project, which is really the first phase was focused on multi-hazard risk assessment of the port and the airport. These are two really key assets that connect the Cook Islands to the rest of the world. So not only connecting them to the rest of the world, but connecting Rarotonga to the outer islands. So they're super important for the functioning of the country. And we looked at flooding, and we quantified how likely it is for the airport and the port's operations to be disrupted in the future. And we also captured what the financial losses would be from something like a cyclone, for example. And then because of their importance to the country, we then looked at what the economic impact would be to the broader country. And so, if the airport's down, for example, you're not getting tourists in. If the port's down, you're not getting food and fuel. A lot of I think 100% of the fuel comes through the port, and 90% of the food comes through the port. And so, these assets, if they're disrupted, then have broader economic implications. And so, as Matt said, the Cook Islands is already doing a lot of great work, has been doing that for a long time now, and doing work beyond the areas of our study. But just to maybe reiterate what Matt was saying around the importance of having this data to be able to make the right decisions about where to invest when you're thinking about adapting to climate. It really gives you a good understanding. Undertaking these risk assessments gives you that understanding of what are the risks, where are the vulnerabilities, you know, so that you can target the right things and solve the right problems. So I think that's one thing that I think is really important about having that risk information. And then the second piece is quantifying the impacts. So how many days will the airport be down? How much does this contribute to the broader economy? Really helps to build the business case to enable countries like the Cook Islands to access climate financing that will ultimately be needed to fund the projects and the programs and the infrastructure that will be required to adapt to climate change in the future. And so I'd say, yeah, we're working with Matt. We know the Cook Islands is doing a lot of great work, and I know that there are a number of other island nations that are also doing work in this space as well.
And we love hearing about specific projects or programs. Matt, do you have a favorite project that you've been working on that you want to share with us? Because we like to get into the nitty gritty of what's working.
Yeah, okay. There's lots of different projects that we have going at the moment. One that I really enjoy actually is a program we have with working with our outer islands, our Paenua, as they're referred to here. It's working with the communities on each of those islands to document their local dialect or their local language, if it's a different language, for climate and ocean sort of parameters and climate change parameters. So really, it's an excuse for having a conversation about climate and climate change with those communities. So if you like, the vehicle is about their local language and asking them, what words do they use to describe their seasons or different types of weather patterns or different ocean processes, tides, currents, all of that. Had over a couple of days with each community. But in the course of that discussion, we really unpack a lot of different themes around climate and climate change and really raise awareness with those communities around how climate and climate change might impact on their island or them as people. And so this idea of the local language and building up this list of local terminology and local words, island by island, is how we're moving through our islands. There's 12 different inhabited islands, and we're slowly making our way around. And it's amazing to have those discussions with people to build their awareness of climate and climate change, but at the same time, document their local context and their local language for these things. And eventually, hopefully, that information will be used to provide better specific information to, in their own language for each island, tailored to what their island needs. But for now, it's a good discussion and a good dialogue, and it's really nice to be able to sit down at that community level and see that. It's amazing to have perhaps some senior fishermen in a village having these debates with some of the older women who do some of the planting and growing about what the correct word is for this or that or the other. And it's amazing how passionate they are about getting these things right. Something that on a technical level seems quite simple, when you go to that community level, it is far from simple. So it's a really interesting little project that we have and have been doing for the last couple of years. Yeah.
And Karen, I'd love to hear about some specific projects that you've been working on that can add some context to this, please.
Yeah, sure. So one project that I think really resonates with the one that Matt mentioned is one that I worked on in the Dominican Republic. So this was in a small community in Los Santos Abajo. in the northwestern Dominican Republic. And so, the Dominican Republic's in the Caribbean. They're exposed to hurricanes and to earthquakes. And this community was experiencing flooding. So, not just from hurricanes, but also from smaller storms. And we looked at the data, we looked at the flood models and looked at the drainage capacity and all of those types of things. But then we went out into the community and met with community leaders and residents to talk about their experiences. And we found that actually one of the big contributors to flooding was waste being put into the streams. And this is something that we see in a lot of places. But in this case, really, the solution to, or part of the solution to solving flooding wasn't an engineering solution. It was more around waste management and education. And so, yeah, for me, working at this local level really highlighted the importance of understanding the context, I think, as Matt was saying, in which I'm working. And, this isn't something that a national level study would have picked up. And so, yeah, this project is just a little bit different and really highlighted that importance of getting out on the ground.
I love it. And it highlights the power of partnership with our communities. Like, we can't just do things to people, we have to do things with people, which moves us on to the power of partnership, a huge part of our podcast, because we can't do things on our own. Karen, you partner with so many different organizations. You get to see lots of different things. Can you share your perspective with us around the power of partnership, especially around climate resilience and what you're seeing as to how it can maybe help things happen better or differently?
Yeah, absolutely. I actually might want to throw this one to Matt because I feel like Matt has a really great lands or understanding of kind of the broader landscape, and then I might be able to complement with my response.
For us, partnerships are essential to drive things forward. We don't have the human resources to do it alone here. We're trying to build our human resource capacity to solve some of these complex issues, but we can't go it alone. And so we in our office, in our climate change office, we're a bridge between our communities and the rest of the world in the climate change space, this big technical world. And that bridge, we facilitate everything in that spectrum through partnerships. And whether that's solving technical problems and getting that technical understanding with the likes of Karen, or whether it's the bigger picture thinking around our development aspirations and our climate adaptation aspirations as a country. And with that, we partner with perhaps bilateral partners, Australia, New Zealand, those kind of partners, multilateral development banks, as Karen mentioned earlier. And when we have those partnerships, that's everything across the spectrum, from them understanding what we are aspiring to as a country and how we need to unlock that. So it's designing projects, it's designing financing pipelines to make those projects a reality. It's bringing in technical specialists to help us understand some of the, the more engineering aspects, perhaps, or that kind of thing. It might be social specialists to work with us in our communities. But those partners have that full spectrum, and they work with us on that across the board. And then, within that, we also have technical partners that help bring in that expertise that perhaps we just don't have enough of in country. We have very, very good local knowledge. We have some very good scientific and technical knowledge, but not enough to solve all of our problems. So we look at how we can bring in groups from perhaps regional technical organizations, within the Pacific, who understand that context very well. Perhaps international specialists, like Karen and her team, to come in and work with our own technical specialists and complement that local knowledge. So that partnership is across the board, whether you're talking financing, whether you're talking technical work, but everything that's needed to bridge that gap and ultimately create better outcomes for our communities. That's where it sort of comes from. So hopefully that's given some broader context. I'll just go back to Karen maybe to fill in her bit.
Yeah, sure. And yeah, I think that was really helpful, Matt, to kind of get that, broader context and understanding of kind of where the technical piece fits in, because that's really where Arup and my team comes in to provide that technical basis. And so, we can run the analysis, we can design the solutions, and we can work alongside when these projects are being constructed. But ultimately, kind of that's it. That's our role. But then it's, people like Matt who need to, and, the other agencies in the Cook Islands and beyond that really need to own the solutions that we're proposing to adapt to climate change. And so they're the ones that need to be there to ensure its longevity and its success. And so for us as technical specialists, it's really important for us to keep that in mind, and to work alongside them and partner with them as we're designing these technical solutions to make sure that we're capturing, their priorities, the making sure it's contextually appropriate, and all of those things, that so it will ultimately be successful. So yeah, so that's kind of where I see Arup's role fitting into the broader picture, and we absolutely wouldn't be doing this work if it weren't for partners like Matt and Climate Change Cook Islands.
Amazing. And look, I just want to take a second to talk about island nations in general. Like, I think sometimes we forget how exposed they might be, how there's large populations living in low lying lands. And really, they're going to be the first that are affected by some of the climate change challenges. So, do either of you have any comments on why we should be focused on island nations or paying attention?
Yeah, for me, I guess there's a couple. The first one is just the idea of justice, right? So these nations are at the forefront of adapting to climate change because they have to be, and but by and large, they aren't the ones who have caused the problem. They aren't the ones who have contributed to the emissions in the same way that other nations have. And so, yeah, for me, really, this idea of justice. But if that's not enough, and I know sometimes it isn't enough, uh, there are parts of the US that are also tackling the same types of problems. And, in California, there are parts of Highway 1 along the coastline that's, having to be relocated due to wave damage and erosion. And there are communities in, Alaska and Louisiana that are thinking about relocation to adapt to climate change. And so I think there's a lot that we can learn from how island nations are tackling these problems at the moment. So yeah, I think that's the two of the reasons.
Yeah, it's far from simple. There's a lot more to it than economics, I would say. There's a lot of depth and cultural complexity and these kind of things that come into play when we start talking about climate change and climate impacts. And I know, Michelle, you mentioned that we have quite big communities in low-lying islands that are exposed. We also have some very, very small communities in low-lying islands that are exposed. And when I think about vulnerability, perhaps it's those small communities that are the most exposed because of the impacts between climate and social structure, basically. And it takes a certain number of people to run an island, and when it just gets too hard, it just gets too hard. And climate impacts everybody differently. It's not the same, but it's also not easy to take people from their home and pop them somewhere else, even if it is a small number of them. Perhaps, there's cultural ties, but there's also family ties and all these other emotional things that go with it. So there's the justice element, as Karen said, but it's a lot, it's more than that. It's about where people want to be. And even when I think about internally, domestically within our country, across our 12 inhabited islands, land ownership is firmly tied in your cultural and blood links to which of those islands you have links to. And so one might think it's easy to move around within the country and own land, but it's far from that. It's much, much more complicated than that. And, when I look at our northern islands up towards the equator, which are our low-lying atolls, mixed population sizes, but most of those people, that's their family roots, their blood ties are in those atolls. They're not in our southern volcanic islands that have elevation, yeah? So it's not going to impact all Cook Islanders equally, and not all of them have the same opportunity to adapt and to reduce their exposure to climate risks. So it's not an easy discussion. It's not an easy equation. And when you multiply that across the whole Pacific region or small islands across the world, it is difficult. And it's difficult whether it's a small population or a big population.
And so we move to the final part of our podcast as we're almost out of time. But this is also my favorite part. We call it the tips and tricks section. And so, what are the insights that you have learned that you would like to share with others who might want to go on this journey or who are starting on this journey? In my role, I've worked with many Pacific Island nations in education, helping to bring localized science learning to the classrooms. And there are so many lessons that I wish I knew at the beginning that I've had to learn the hard way. So, Matt, I'm going to start with you. What would you like to share with our listeners about a bit of advice or maybe some insight into what you do?
Yeah, this is a good question, and I do wish I knew everything I knew now 10 years ago, of course. Context is really important, I think, working in this space, and the context is very different community to community. So I think definitely appreciating that context as much as possible on the ground helps for better solutions. And Karen talked about it before. It's about ownership of those solutions and ownership of problems as well. But understanding that context and locally is really important. For us, delivering projects in a country where some of our islands are over 1,000 kilometers away, and it might take us a few days to get there by boat, or it might take a charter aircraft that's tens of thousands of dollars to move a small team to go and do work with that community. It's not cheap. It's not easy. And it's difficult, and you need to understand that context in terms of trying to move forward. And that context looks different for every country in the Pacific. So I think understanding context is important, and I think understanding the complexity of the culture and the diversity of culture across islands is also really important. And no matter how good a technical solution might be, if it's not sensitive to the culture and custom, it won't go forward. If it doesn't have local ownership, then it shouldn't go forward, and it probably won't. So I think for me, understanding that context and understanding that complexity is really important to be able to work in this space and move forward in this space, and to be able to span, I guess, everything between what communities need at that level through to perhaps what government's doing as their representatives. Yeah.
And Karen, what are your tips or tricks?
I think for me, a lot of what Matt said really resonates. I think I'm an engineer, and so I come at this from an engineering, a technical perspective. But really, when we're thinking about adapting to climate change, this isn't a technical problem. We can design, we know how to flood-proof buildings, we know how to build seawalls, we can design a super robust engineering solution. But ultimately, that's not the challenge here. There are the issues that Matt mentioned around, culture and identity, and there are many different competing priorities. And to get that political will behind a solution, and then not to mention, more practically speaking, getting the funding to solve these problems. These are all big challenges, and I think that that's something that I've definitely learned along the way. But I do, there are a lot of great minds working on these problems, people like Matt who've dedicated their careers to this. And so I am hopeful.
I think we all have to be hopeful. It's been really lovely talking to you both. Thank you both for sharing so much with us and for being here today.
Thanks, Michelle.
Thanks, Michelle.
That conversation was so insightful and a great reminder that even with the smartest engineers and technical people helping to solve some big global problems, long-term sustainable solutions only come when there's an authentic partnership with the people on the ground that it affects. If you like this episode, don't forget to leave us a review and subscribe to Sustainable Forces on your favorite streaming service.